If you are spiritually awakened, never reveal these 5 truths. Nietzsche warned. Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery was never about the death of God or the Übermensch. It was about what happens when someone truly awakens to the truths that society is not prepared to hear. In his most obscure and misunderstood works, Nietzsche documented a disturbing pattern. People who see beyond collective illusions and dare to speak about it are systematically silenced, isolated, and even destroyed, not because they are wrong, but because the truth they carry is unbearable for most. The truly awakened, those who have seen beyond the veils of social conventions and imposed moralities, discover that society does not reward clarity, it punishes it. I'm about to reveal the 5 truths that Nietzsche identified as particularly dangerous to share, even when you have discovered them yourself. Why he believed these truths specifically should remain hidden, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Why revealing these truths prematurely not only puts you at risk but sabotages your own philosophical evolution. And why the true power of these ideas can only be preserved through a specific type of silence. If you've ever wondered why your deepest insights seem to alienate people around you, why the more clearly you see, the more alone you feel, Nietzsche would have a disturbing explanation, an explanation few are willing to consider, but one that, once understood, permanently changes your relationship with truth and with the world around you. The pattern Nietzsche observed is as relevant today as it was in the 19th century, perhaps even more so. In an age where we supposedly value free speech and open discourse, certain fundamental truths remain as dangerous to articulate as they were during the Inquisition. Only the methods of silencing have become more sophisticated. Instead of burning heretics at the stake, we now employ social ostracism, character assassination, and intellectual marginalization. The mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. Society has immune systems designed to neutralize threatening truths. Nietzsche himself experienced this repeatedly. His work, Beyond Good and Evil, was met with hostile reviews and poor sales. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, now considered his masterpiece, was largely ignored during his lifetime. By the time he wrote Ecce Homo, his intellectual autobiography, he had become painfully aware of the consequences of speaking too clearly too soon. It was this awareness that led him to develop strategies for navigating the dangerous waters of profound truth, strategies that we would be wise to understand today. Before revealing these 5 dangerous truths, we need to understand why Nietzsche, the philosopher of the hammer, who dedicated his life to demolishing idols and illusions, paradoxically advocated silence regarding certain discoveries. This seems to contradict everything we know about him, doesn't it? The man who declared that there are no facts, only interpretations, and who proclaimed the death of God was actually suggesting that some truths should remain unspoken? The paradox resolves when we understand what Nietzsche discovered about the process of philosophical awakening. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." This is not a warning against seeking truth, but a caution about how truth transforms the seeker, and more importantly, how society reacts to that transformation. Nietzsche understood something that many modern seekers of truth fail to grasp. The path of awakening isn't just about accumulating insights or knowledge. It's a process of becoming, of psychological and spiritual transformation. Each profound truth you internalize doesn't just add to your understanding, it fundamentally alters who you are. And this transformation makes you increasingly unintelligible to those who haven't undergone similar changes. Consider his own transformation. Friedrich Nietzsche began as a respected philologist, firmly established within the academic world. As his philosophical insights deepened, he found himself increasingly isolated, not just socially but intellectually. By the time he wrote his later works, he was addressing an audience that didn't yet exist, what he called posthumous people, readers who would only be born in future generations. Nietzsche noticed a pattern repeated throughout history. Those who see too deeply and speak too soon rarely manage to achieve the cultural transformation they hope for. Instead, they are neutralized, marginalized, or converted into caricatures. Think of Socrates forced to drink poison, of Giordano Bruno burned at the stake, of Galileo forced to recant his discoveries. The pattern repeats continuously. Society has mechanisms to protect itself against truths that threaten its foundations. Look at what happened to Spinoza, excommunicated by his Jewish community for his pantheistic vision. Or consider Schopenhauer, whose pessimistic insights were too bitter for his contemporaries to swallow, leaving him isolated for decades. Even in the scientific realm, think of Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered that doctors should wash their hands before delivering babies. a simple truth that his medical colleagues refused to accept, leading to his breakdown and death in an asylum. But Nietzsche wasn't interested in martyrs. He was interested in transformation, in creating what he called free spirits and eventually the Übermensch or Overman, individuals who could transcend the limitations of herd morality and create their own values. And to do this, he realized a more strategic approach was necessary. Nietzsche's strategy wasn't about concealing truth permanently, but about understanding the proper sequence of revelation, both to oneself and to others. In Human, All Too Human, he describes the process of becoming a free spirit as involving stages of liberation, each with its own challenges and dangers. To rush this process is to risk getting stuck in rebellion or nihilism, rather than achieving the creative freedom he saw as the ultimate goal. This is where we enter the 5 truths that Nietzsche considered dangerous to reveal, even when discovered, not because they should remain hidden forever, but because their premature revelation impedes the very philosophical growth that makes them meaningful. Because shared at the wrong time or with the wrong people, these truths don't liberate. They trigger a social immune response that ultimately neutralizes both the ideas and their bearer. The first dangerous truth, morality as control strategy. Nietzsche realized something disturbing about the moral systems governing our societies. In his Genealogy of Morals, he traces the origins of our concepts of good and evil, not to some divine truth or universal reason, but to strategies of power. Morality, in his view, did not arise from a search for goodness, but as a tool of the weak to control the strong. He wrote, "The judgments good and bad have an origin. The nobility and the powerful were the first to call themselves and their actions good, as opposed to everything that was low, low-minded, common, and plebeian." Later, through what he called the slave revolt in morality, this evaluation was inverted. What was bad, in the sense of inferior, became evil, in the sense of morally condemnable. This genealogical approach to morality reveals something profoundly unsettling. Our deepest moral intuitions, which we experience as self-evident truths, are in fact historical products with contingent origins. The moral outrage that feels so natural to us, the righteous indignation against evil, is itself a historical development, not an eternal truth. Nietzsche goes further in his deconstruction. He suggests that what we call conscience is not the voice of God or universal reason within us, but the internalized voice of the herd, the accumulated weight of social conditioning. As he writes in Daybreak, morality is the herd instinct in the individual. What feels most deeply personal and sacred, our sense of right and wrong, is in fact the most thoroughly social and constructed aspect of our psyches. This is an explosive insight. Our deepest notions of right and wrong are not absolute truths, but historical constructs born of struggles for power. When you truly internalize this truth, every moral structure around you begins to seem arbitrary. Every moral indignation reveals itself as a power game in disguise. Consider how this plays out in contemporary society. Political movements, religious institutions, and social justice causes all clothe their will to power in the language of moral righteousness. Even our most personal moral judgments serve social functions we rarely acknowledge. They signal our allegiance to certain groups, they help establish hierarchies, they justify existing power arrangements. To see clearly how morality functions as a control mechanism doesn't mean abandoning all values, but it does mean recognizing the contingency and instrumental nature of moral systems that present themselves as absolute and unconditional. It means developing what Nietzsche calls the intellectual conscience, a higher responsibility to truth than to established moral frameworks. Here's the danger: sharing this insight prematurely. When you try to explain to people deeply invested in a moral system that their morality is essentially a strategy of social control, you don't liberate them. You threaten the very structure that gives meaning and order to their lives. The response is not gratitude, but rejection and hostility. Consider what happens when someone tries to expose the moral contradictions of a religious community they belong to, or when someone points out that a political movement's righteous claims mask a raw desire for power. These insights, even when accurate, rarely convince those invested in the moral framework being critiqued. Instead, the critic is labeled as immoral, as dangerous as corrupt, precisely the terms of condemnation built into the moral system itself. As one of Nietzsche's early scholars discovered when trying to share these ideas with religious colleagues, the response was not serious reflection, but accusations of nihilism and immorality. He not only failed to convince, he lost his position, his reputation, and the very platform necessary to cultivate a new understanding. Nietzsche experienced this himself. When he published Beyond Good and Evil and on the Genealogy of Morals, he was not praised for his intellectual courage, but accused of moral corruption. His critique of Christian morality as slave morality was not understood as an invitation to a higher responsibility, but as an attack on all values. His work was mischaracterized as advocating for egoism and cruelty, rather than for a more honest and life-affirming approach to creating values. Nietzsche warns, those who perceive the contingent nature of morality must guard this insight until they have developed a positive alternative, until you have created your own values to fill the void, until you have completed what he calls the revaluation of all values. Sharing this truth is harmful to both you and others. This doesn't mean forever concealing what you've understood about morality's true nature, but it does mean developing your own affirmative values before you start dismantling others' moral frameworks. It means becoming a creator of values, not just a destroyer of illusions. As Nietzsche writes, whoever must be a creator always annihilates. The second dangerous truth, the self as narrative fiction, perhaps Nietzsche's most destabilizing discovery, and one he suggests should be kept silent until one is prepared for its implications, is the illusory nature of the self. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "What gives me the right to speak of an I, and even of an I as cause, and finally, of an I as the cause of thoughts?" Nietzsche realized what modern neurosciences have confirmed. Our sense of a unified and consistent self, controlling our actions and thoughts, is largely a retrospective construction. There is no fixed inner I directing the show. What we call the self is a multiplicity of impulses, instincts, desires, and learned patterns competing for control, while our consciousness constructs a narrative to explain what has already happened. He writes in The Will to Power, the assumption of one single subject is perhaps unnecessary. Perhaps it is just as permissible to assume a multiplicity of subjects whose interaction and struggle is the basis of our thought and our consciousness in general, a kind of aristocracy of cells in which dominion resides. To be sure, an aristocracy of equals, used to ruling jointly and understanding how to command. This insight is not just philosophically radical, it's psychologically destabilizing. Our entire sense of identity, of being someone, depends on the fiction of a unified self. Our legal systems, our interpersonal relationships, our sense of moral responsibility, all presuppose that we are coherent selves who endure through time and are the authors of our actions. As he explains, there is no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Consider what this means. Your sense of being a continuous person with a coherent personality, consistent preferences, and a linear life story is largely a convenient fiction. The person you were a decade ago, the person you are now, and the person you will be in the future are not the same entity. They are different configurations of impulses, different patterns of thought and feeling, linked together by a story you tell yourself. This doesn't mean that all is chaos, but it does mean that the unity and consistency we experience in ourselves is an achievement, a creation, rather than a given fact. As Nietzsche puts it, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. This insight dissolves the foundations of fundamental concepts like personal responsibility, moral choice, and free will. If there is no unified self making choices but only competing processes without a central controller, then the foundation of moral responsibility crumbles. Yet our entire society is built on the assumption that we are responsible selves. Our legal systems presuppose that the person who committed a crime 10 years ago is the same person being punished today. Our interpersonal relationships depend on the belief that the person we love is a consistent entity, not a constantly changing configuration of forces. Our economic systems assume that the person who entered into a contract is the same person who will fulfill it. The average person hearing this doesn't feel liberation but terror. Our society, our laws, our personal relationships are built on the fiction of consistent, responsible selves. To suggest that this fundamental structure is illusory doesn't liberate people. It disorients them, often in dangerous ways. Nietzsche witnessed this among his contemporaries who flirted with these ideas. Without the preparatory work to build a new foundation beyond the illusion of self, they descended into despair or a futile kind of hedonism. They intellectually understood the critique, but didn't possess the strength to create something new from it. Consider what happens when someone half understands this truth. They may decide that since the self is illusory, there is no point in self-development or ethical behavior. Since there is no real me, they might reason, I might as well indulge every impulse. This is the nihilistic misreading of Nietzsche's insight, the very misreading he was trying to prevent. What Nietzsche was pointing toward was not nihilism, but a higher responsibility. If the self is not given but made, then we have the awesome and terrible responsibility to create ourselves, not by inventing something out of nothing, but by actively shaping the forces that constitute us. As he writes in The gay science, one thing is needful, to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. That's why Nietzsche warned, this truth must be cultivated privately, until you have developed what he calls the will to power, not a desire to dominate others, but the strength to create meaning and direction without resorting to the illusions of fixed identity. Until then, sharing this insight is like giving dynamite to a child. The third dangerous truth, the constructed nature of consensual reality. Decades before sociologists like Berger and Luckmann wrote about the social construction of reality, Nietzsche recognized something deeply disturbing. The world we inhabit is not the real world, but a collective interpretation we build together through language, social conventions, and power structures. In The Gay Science, he presents the parable of the madman who searches for God. The man declares that we have killed God, but realizes that this news has come too early. Most people don't even understand the meaning or implications of this death. What Nietzsche was signaling wasn't just the decline of religion, but the collapse of any externally guaranteed structure of meaning. The death of God for Nietzsche means the death of all absolute foundations, not just religious ones, but also the shadows of God that persist in secular forms, absolute truth, objective morality, intrinsic meaning. As he writes, but when Boscovich had taught us to abjure the belief in the last thing of the earth that stood firm, the belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum and particle atom, it was the greatest triumph over the senses that has hitherto been gained on earth. He realized that all our truths, not just religious but scientific, social, and political ones, are interpretations, not facts. There are no facts, only interpretations, he wrote. And this too is an interpretation. This insight goes beyond simple relativism. Nietzsche isn't saying that all interpretations are equally valid, but that no interpretation has the absolute status we tend to attribute to truth. Some interpretations serve life better than others. Some open more possibilities. Some require more courage to maintain, but none can claim to be the final word, the absolute truth. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "We have arranged for ourselves a world in which we can live, by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes and effects, motion and rest, form and content. Without these articles of faith, nobody now could endure life, but that does not prove them. Life is no argument. When you truly grasp this truth, the social reality around you begins to seem arbitrary, contingent, almost dreamlike. You see how structures of authority, social hierarchies, political and economic systems are maintained, not by some inherent truth, but by collective consent and power. Consider how this plays out in our lives. We live in a world where pieces of paper, money, have value because we collectively act as though they do, where invisible lines, national borders, determine who can go where abstract entities, corporations, nations, religions, command the loyalties and energies of millions. None of these things exist in nature. All are interpretations, constructions, agreements, but they are not mere illusions. These interpretations have real power precisely because they are collectively maintained. The nation-state may be an interpretation, but its armies are quite real. Money may be a social construction, but its ability to feed or starve people is undeniable. These are what Nietzsche called effective errors, interpretations that have become so embedded in our practices that they take on a reality of their own. To see through these constructions is not to be free of them. It is to recognize their contingency, their historicity, their invented nature, even as you continue to navigate the world they constitute. This double consciousness, seeing both the constructed nature of reality and the necessity of living within it, is what Nietzsche called the perspective of perspectives. But sharing this insight with those who aren't prepared doesn't liberate them. It confuses them or makes them defensive. As Nietzsche observed, many people prefer will to nothingness over nothingness of will. They would rather have any meaning, even an oppressive or illusory one, than confront the void of meaninglessness. Consider how people react when fundamental aspects of their reality are questioned. When religious believers are confronted with historical evidence undermining their sacred texts, they don't typically abandon their faith. They find ways to reinterpret or compartmentalize the challenging information. When nationalists are shown the arbitrary and recent nature of national identities, they don't become cosmopolitans. They often double down on patriotic narratives. One of Nietzsche's students, trying to explain the constructed nature of social conventions to colleagues, found himself quickly labeled as subversive and excluded from the institutions where he had hoped to create change. He not only failed to convey the truth but lost the position from which he might have cultivated a deeper understanding. Nietzsche understood that most people are not equipped to live without the security of given truths. As he wrote, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. When people lose faith in their interpretive frameworks, without having developed the capacity to create new ones, the result is not liberation but despair. That's why Nietzsche's goal wasn't to convince everyone of the constructed nature of reality. It was to prepare a few, those with the potential to become free spirits, for the task of creating new values, new interpretations, new possibilities of meaning, not arbitrary ones, but ones that affirm life, that expand human potential, that embrace rather than deny the complexity of existence. Nietzsche's lesson: before revealing the constructed nature of social reality, you must first develop what he calls affirmative thinking, the ability to create meaning in the face of apparent absurdity, to affirm life without metaphysical guarantees. Without this capacity, truth doesn't liberate, it paralyzes. The fourth dangerous truth, resentment as social engine, one of Nietzsche's most provocative insights, and one he suggests should be kept silent until the appropriate time, is the role of resentment in the functioning of society. In French, ressentiment, a psychological state arising from the repression of feelings of envy and hatred that cannot be directly expressed. In his Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traces how this ressentiment, this accumulated rancor of the powerless against the powerful, became a creative force behind social institutions, political systems, and ideologies. What appears noble and elevated, equality, rights, justice, often has its roots in resentment disguised as virtue. While all noble morality grows out of a triumphant saying yes to itself, slave morality says no from the very outset to what is outside, different, not oneself. This slave morality, born of resentment, presents its weakness as moral choice, its powerlessness as goodness, its submission as obedience to a higher principle. This insight is deeply unsettling because it suggests that much of what we consider most elevated in our moral traditions, compassion for the weak, concern for equality, the critique of power, may have originated not in love or justice, but in the subterranean emotions of envy, revenge, and hatred. As Nietzsche puts it, this inversion of the value-positing I, this need to direct one's view outward instead of back to oneself, is the essence of resentment. In order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally reaction. Consider how this plays out in contemporary society. Political movements claiming to fight for justice often display a barely concealed delight in the downfall of their opponents. Religious communities condemn the sinfulness of others with a fervor that suggests psychological compensation. Social media outrage offers the pleasures of moral superiority without the difficult work of actual virtue. This doesn't mean that all claims for justice or equality are mere expressions of resentment, but it does suggest that our motives are rarely as pure as we present them, that the emotions driving our moral stances are often darker and more complex than we admit, even to ourselves. Nietzsche was not advocating for a return to the unrestrained power of the strong over the weak, the noble morality he describes in his genealogy. He recognized that such a return is neither possible nor desirable, but he was suggesting that genuine spiritual and cultural evolution requires transcending resentment, not disguising it as virtue. This is an acidic insight. Much of what we celebrate as moral progress can be explained as sublimated resentment. Equality may be a mask for the desire to bring down the powerful. Compassion may hide secret satisfaction in the weakness of others. To truly see this dynamic at work in society, and more painfully in oneself, is to become incapable of the comforting self-deception that one's own moral stances are purely motivated by love of good. It is to recognize the complex amalgam of noble and base motives that drive all human action, including one's own. A contemporary academic of Nietzsche tried to present this idea at a conference on social reform. The reaction was immediate and fierce. He was denounced as an advocate of cruelty, an enemy of progress, an apologist for oppression. He not only failed to communicate the complex truth, his career and influence were permanently diminished. The problem was not just that his audience disagreed with his analysis. It was that the very framework of the discussion, the shared moral language of the reformers, was itself a product of the resentment he was trying to expose. To accept his analysis would require his audience to question not just their specific moral positions but the very structure of evaluation through which they understood themselves and their world. Nietzsche's warning is clear. Before speaking about resentment as a social force, you must first transcend it in yourself. You must cultivate what he calls amor fati, love of fate, the ability to affirm life without needing to justify your suffering through the blame of others. Without this capacity, Speaking of this truth only reveals and intensifies your own resentment. Consider Nietzsche's own life. Despite suffering from debilitating health problems, repeated professional disappointments, and profound personal isolation, he strove to embody his ideal of amor fati. As he wrote in Exe Homo, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendaciousness in the face of what is necessary, but love it. This is not stoic resignation, but active affirmation, a fundamental yes-saying to life that transcends both optimism and pessimism. It is to love life not despite but with all its suffering, all its contradictions, all its terrible beauty. Only from this stance can one speak about resentment without reinforcing it, expose its workings without being driven by it. This is the higher perspective Nietzsche was pointing toward, not a mere intellectual understanding but an embodied transcendence of the reactive patterns he was diagnosing. The fifth dangerous truth, the will to power. Nietzsche's most central insight, and the one he most warned against sharing prematurely, is what he called the will to power, Wille zur Macht. Misunderstood as a simple desire to dominate others, the will to power is, for Nietzsche, the fundamental impulse not just of humans but of all life, the tendency to exert and expand one's strength, overcome resistances, extend one's influence. Life, he wrote, is precisely will to power, not about survival as Darwin suggested, but about self-expression, expansion, and self-overcoming. Life seeks not merely to preserve itself, but to surpass itself. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, physiologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. This is not a mere psychological observation but a metaphysical insight. The fundamental character of reality is not matter, not spirit, not rational order, but dynamic force. Power in constant self-overcoming. As he puts it in his notebooks, this world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. This insight subverts our most cherished narratives about ourselves. We think we seek truth, but in reality we are exercising our will to power through knowledge. We think we act morally, but we are expressing our will to power through judgments about others. We believe we love disinterestedly, but even love is an expression of will. Consider how this plays out in our lives. The scientist who claims to pursue pure knowledge is in fact expressing his will to power through mastery of a domain. The moral reformer who condemns society's failings is exercising her will to power through judgment. Even the ascetic who renounces worldly power is expressing will to power against himself, the most difficult victory of all. This doesn't mean all actions are equal, or that might makes right. Nietzsche distinguishes between active and reactive expressions of will to power. The former creates, affirms, expands possibilities. The latter seeks only to negate, to tear down, to restrict. The former is the expression of strength and abundance, the latter of weakness and lack. This truth is dangerous because, misunderstood, it seems to reduce all human motivation to a kind of cosmic selfishness. Misapplied, it seems to justify exploitation and domination. As a contemporary of Nietzsche discovered, trying to explain the will to power in a political context, his ideas were immediately distorted and used to justify exactly the kind of crude power politics that Nietzsche despised. This is exactly what happened to Nietzsche's work after his death. His sister Elizabeth, who controlled his literary estate, selectively edited his writings to align with her own nationalistic and anti-Semitic views. His concept of will to power was twisted into a justification for German imperialism and later Nazi ideology, precisely the kind of reactive, resentment-driven expressions of power that Nietzsche himself condemned. Nietzsche insisted, the will to power must first be understood in relation to oneself before being applied to the world. True will to power is not dominating others, but mastering oneself, overcoming one's own limitations, creating values that affirm life. As he wrote, the man who has become free treads with happy and confident step over terrors and prejudices of others. His liberation from some belief means his strength of will. This is the great health Nietzsche points toward, not the absence of sickness but the capacity to incorporate sickness into a larger vitality, not the denial of our darker impulses but their integration into a more comprehensive strength, not the rejection of suffering but its transformation into growth. Until you have cultivated this self-mastery, sharing this insight only feeds the lower, reactive impulses that Nietzsche sought to transcend. People hear will to power and think it justifies their desire to control others, when in fact it challenges them to control and transform themselves. The paradox of Nietzschean silence. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Nietzsche's warning about these 5 truths is the paradox it presents. The very truths that can liberate are the ones that most dangerously can imprison us when shared prematurely or indiscriminately. Nietzsche encountered this paradox in his own life. His ideas, even during his lifetime, were often distorted, misunderstood, and used for purposes he would have abhorred. After his death, this misapplication reached tragic extremes when elements of his philosophy were twisted to support totalitarian ideologies. The irony is profound. Nietzsche, who dedicated his life to destroying illusions, found himself advocating for a kind of strategic silence about the most liberating truths, not out of timidity or compromise, but out of recognition that truth is not just a matter of correct propositions, but of lived understanding, and that such understanding follows a necessary sequence, a developmental logic that cannot be short-circuited without creating new, possibly worse illusions. That's why he wrote in Beyond Good and Evil. What is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. And also, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. The deepest truths must be lived before they are proclaimed. Consider what happened to Eastern spiritual traditions when they were suddenly imported to the West in the 20th century. Practices and insights that had been developed within careful disciplinary contexts were suddenly popularized and commercialized. The result was often a superficial understanding that reduced profound traditions to self-help techniques or exotic lifestyle accessories. The liberating potential of these traditions was frequently neutralized by premature and decontextualized exposure. The philosopher Walter Kaufmann, who rescued Nietzsche from distorted interpretations, explained what he called the Nietzschean silence, the practice of withholding certain truths, not out of fear, but out of reverence for their potency and recognition of the harm they can cause when released into the world without the appropriate context. Nietzsche wasn't advocating dishonesty. He was advocating what he called gift-giving virtue, sharing only the truths that truly benefit the recipient at the time when they can be received as gifts, not as poisons. As he puts it, and if a friend does you wrong, then say, I forgive you what you did to me, but that you have done it to yourself. How could I forgive that? This brings us to the central question. How then should we handle these dangerous truths? The path of strategic awakening. Nietzsche offered a path that is neither a cowardly denial of truth nor a reckless revelation. It's what we might call strategic awakening, the cultivation of dangerous truths first in oneself, creating the inner strength necessary to live them before attempting to communicate them. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his protagonist descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, only to discover that the world isn't ready for it. He must learn to fish for those rare individuals capable of understanding his message without distorting it. The pattern is instructive. Zarathustra doesn't abandon his mission to communicate truth, but he learns to be strategic about how and with whom he shares it. He speaks in parables and songs. He tests his listeners. He accepts that most people will misunderstand him and focuses on finding the few who can truly hear. This is the model Nietzsche proposes, not denying what you see, but being strategic about how and with whom you share it. Cultivate the dangerous truths in yourself until they mature into a wisdom that can be offered as a gift, not thrown like a bomb. A follower of Nietzsche who understood this lesson was the psychologist Carl Jung. Although deeply influenced by Nietzsche's insights into the nature of the psyche and morality, Jung rarely attributed these ideas directly to Nietzsche in his public work. Instead, he integrated them into a system that made them accessible and useful, even to those who weren't prepared for their full source. Jung recognized that Nietzsche's insights about the illusory nature of the unified self aligned with his own discoveries about the collective unconscious and the archetypes, but rather than presenting these insights as a demolition of the ego, he framed them within a developmental context, the process of individuation that gave people a path to follow, rather than just an abyss to fall into. Similarly, when Jung dealt with the dark sides of human nature, what Nietzsche called the will to power and Jung called the shadow, he did so within a therapeutic context that allowed people to integrate these aspects rather than being destroyed by their sudden revelation. Nietzsche himself modeled this approach. In his writing, he uses masks, allegories, parables, aphorisms, methods that allow different readers to absorb different levels of meaning according to their readiness. As he wrote, every profound spirit needs a mask. His works operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The casual reader might encounter provocative ideas ideas that stimulate thought without necessarily overturning their worldview. The more prepared reader finds deeper challenges to conventional thinking. Only the most dedicated reader, willing to wrestle with the text and follow its implications wherever they lead, encounters the full radical potential of Nietzsche's thought. This is not elitism, but recognition of a developmental reality. Insights that might liberate one person might devastate another, depending on their preparedness. The same sun that helps one plant grow might wither another that's not ready for direct exposure. The consequences of premature revelation. What happens when we ignore Nietzsche's warning and reveal these dangerous truths before we are prepared to bear their consequences? The consequences manifest at several levels. First, at the personal level. As Nietzsche observed, when you share insights that threaten the foundations of the social world, you become a target, not just of rejection, but of a kind of social vengeance. As he wrote, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster." The hostility you face can easily transform you into the opposite of what you aspire to be: bitter, resentful, reactive. Consider what happened to Nietzsche's contemporary, the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. His plays exposed the hypocrisies of bourgeois society, revealing the truth behind conventional morality. The result? He was viciously attacked. His work was initially rejected, and he spent much of his life in self-imposed exile. The truth-teller often ends up isolated and embittered. Nietzsche himself experienced this. Despite his extraordinary philosophical contributions, he died in obscurity, his work largely unrecognized during his lifetime. The emotional toll of his isolation contributed to his psychological breakdown. While this was not the only factor in his collapse, it illustrates the personal cost of standing too far outside society's comfortable illusions. Second, at the interpersonal level, revealing truths for which others aren't prepared rarely enlightens them. More often it confuses or antagonizes them. As Nietzsche realized, truth is the kind of error without which a certain species of life could not live. Tearing away people's sustaining illusions before they have developed alternatives isn't an act of liberation but of cruelty. Consider what happens when someone suddenly tells a deeply religious person that their faith is based on historical fictions, or when someone explains to a patriotic nationalist that national identities are recent social constructions. Even if these claims are intellectually defensible, they don't typically produce enlightenment, but defensiveness, anger, and entrenchment. Nietzsche understood that people cling to their interpretations not out of stupidity but out of existential necessity. These frameworks provide meaning, order, and stability in the face of life's chaos and suffering. To destroy these frameworks without offering anything to replace them is not philosophical courage, but psychological cruelty. Third, at the level of the ideas themselves, when profound truths are released into the world prematurely, they rarely maintain their integrity. They are misunderstood, distorted, co-opted. As happened with Nietzsche's own ideas after his death, they can even be transformed into their opposites. Truth shared too soon doesn't just fail to liberate, it can be transformed into new forms of enslavement. The history of ideas is filled with examples. Marx's critique of capitalism, aimed at human liberation, became the justification for totalitarian states. Darwin's theory of evolution, a scientific breakthrough, was twisted into social Darwinism and eugenic policies. Eastern spiritual practices, meant to liberate from suffering, became commodified into self-improvement techniques that reinforced the ego they were designed to transcend. Nietzsche's own work suffered this fate most dramatically. His critique of slave morality was misinterpreted as advocacy for cruelty. His concept of the will to power was reduced to brute domination. His vision of the Übermensch was perverted into racist fantasies of Aryan supremacy. Ideas meant to liberate humanity from 2,000 years of life-denying morality were used to justify some of history's greatest atrocities, and perhaps most importantly, at the level of your own development. Nietzsche understood that certain truths can only be truly comprehended when lived, not just thought. Sharing these truths before fully embodying them is to deprive yourself of the transformation that comes through silent integration. It's to seek external validation where only inner realization will serve. Consider how many spiritual seekers get stuck in talking about awakening rather than actually awakening, or how many self-proclaimed Nietzscheans become trapped in criticism without developing the creative capacity Nietzsche was ultimately pointing toward. The premature articulation of insight often substitutes for the harder work of embodying that insight. Nietzsche recognized this danger in himself. In Ex Homo, he reflects on how long it took him to understand what he had already written in his earlier works. The intellectual formulation of an idea comes more easily than its integration into one's being. To share an insight before you've fully digested it is to interrupt your own developmental process. When to speak, when to remain silent. This brings us to the practical question: when and how should we share these dangerous truths? Nietzsche offers guidelines through his own practice. First, he suggests seeking what he calls ears that can hear, those rare individuals who demonstrate readiness for challenging truths. As he wrote, "I do not speak to everyone, but only to you who seek me out." This doesn't mean speaking only to those who already agree with you. It means developing sensitivity to where people are in their own development, what frameworks give their lives meaning, what truths they are prepared to integrate without being destroyed. It means recognizing, as Nietzsche did, that different people need different medicines at different stages of their journey. Consider how the great wisdom traditions have handled this challenge. In Buddhism, certain teachings are considered skillful means, truths calibrated to the readiness of the student. In Jewish mysticism, the most profound teachings of Kabbalah were traditionally restricted to mature students who had already mastered the conventional religious framework. In philosophical schools from Pythagoras to Plato, there were exoteric teachings for the general public and esoteric teachings for the initiated. Second, he models indirect communication through parables, metaphors, and masks. The most dangerous truths, he suggests, are best conveyed obliquely, allowing the listener to discover them for themselves. Consider Nietzsche's use of the parable of the madman in The Gay Science. He doesn't baldly state that God is dead and all values are human constructions. He creates a dramatic scene that allows the reader to experience the vertigo of these implications, to feel what it means rather than just intellectually registering the proposition. This approach invites the reader to become an active participant in meaning-making rather than a passive recipient of doctrine. It respects the reader's autonomy and capacity for discovery. And crucially, it allows different readers to engage at the level of depth they are prepared for. Third, he emphasizes the importance of creating before deconstructing. Before challenging others' values, cultivate your own affirmative values. Before pointing out others' illusions, create your own structures of meaning. As Nietzsche puts it, "I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes." The true revolutionary is not the one who tears down, but the one who builds anew. Criticism without creation is the pastime of the weak. The strong first demonstrate an alternative before dismantling the existing structure. Consider how effective social reformers have operated. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just critique segregation, he articulated a positive vision of the beloved community. Gandhi didn't just oppose British rule, he modeled an alternative way of being through his ashrams and constructive program. They understood that people abandon old structures only when they can see a viable alternative. Finally, he constantly reminds us that the deepest truths are embodied, not proclaimed. As he wrote, "Do not believe me, believe in yourself." The true philosopher doesn't seek disciples but partners in self-discovery. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most profound guideline. Truth is not something you possess but something you become. The challenge is not to accumulate correct propositions but to transform your being to embody a different relationship to truth itself. Consider how the great sages have taught. Jesus spoke in parables and lived his teachings through his actions. The Buddha, when asked metaphysical questions, often responded with silence or redirected the questioner to practical matters of liberation. Socrates claimed to know nothing and operated through questions rather than assertions. They understood that the deepest truths cannot be told, only shown, and even then, only to those with eyes to see. The reward of strategic silence. Why then submit to this strategic silence? Why not proclaim the truths we discover, regardless of the consequences? Because Nietzsche suggests, silence in the face of dangerous truths is not a renunciation, but a necessary stage on the path to what he calls the free spirit, one who not only sees beyond society's illusions, but develops the strength to create new values, new interpretations, new possibilities of life. Strategic silence is not an end in itself, but a process of incubation. As he writes in Daybreak, thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, simpler than these. The deepest truths must first be felt, lived, embodied before they can be authentically articulated. Consider how artists work. A painter doesn't immediately display every experiment. A writer doesn't publish first drafts. A composer doesn't perform pieces still in development. They understand that creation requires a protected space, a period of gestation before the work is ready to meet the world. The same applies to philosophical and spiritual insights. These are not mere intellectual propositions, but seeds of new ways of being. They need time and proper conditions to develop their full potential. To expose them prematurely is to risk stunting their growth. This process of silent incubation is what allows dangerous truths to mature into transformative wisdom. It's not an act of cowardice, but of strategic patience. the patience of a gardener who knows that certain seeds need darkness before they are ready for the light. The reward of this patience is profound. Insights that might have remained abstract intellectual positions become living realities. Critiques that might have been merely destructive develop into affirmative alternatives. The negative freedom of escaping old illusions matures into the positive freedom of creating new values. And when these truths finally emerge, after this period of inner cultivation, they emerge not as bombs to demolish but as gifts to transform. As Nietzsche wrote, "I came not to destroy, but to fulfill." The final transmutation. The supreme irony of Nietzsche's philosophy is that his warnings against premature revelation of dangerous truths are, themselves, one of those dangerous truths. Sharing this insight, that certain truths should be kept silent until we are ready to bear them, is risky precisely because it seems to contradict our commitment to honesty and transparency. In a culture that valorizes radical honesty, that insists on transparency as the highest virtue, that equates authenticity with unrestricted self-expression, Nietzsche's strategic approach to truth can appear conservative, even cowardly. It can be misunderstood as elitism, as contempt for the masses, as lack of courage. But as Nietzsche deeply understood, true honesty is not a thoughtless exposure of everything we see. It's a careful assessment of what can be shared, with whom and when, guided not by fear, but by a genuine concern for both truth and those whom it would affect. The Nietzschean approach to truth is not about concealment, but about timing, context, and form. It's about finding the right language, the right metaphors, the right examples to make profound insights accessible without diluting them. It's about creating the conditions where dangerous truths can be received as what they truly are, not threats, but invitations to a higher form of life. This is perhaps Nietzsche's final and deepest lesson about spiritual and philosophical awakening, that the path is not a straight line from ignorance to proclamation, but a spiral of discovery, integration, transmutation, and finally, creative expression. That the deepest truths are not mere assertions to be declared, but seeds to be cultivated until they bloom into new forms of life. As he wrote in his poem, Exe Homo, "Yes, I know where I came from. Insatiable like the flame I burn and consume myself. Light becomes all that I grasp, coal all that I leave, flame I am assuredly." This is the image Nietzsche offers, not the scholar accumulating knowledge, not the critic tearing down illusions, but the flame transforming everything it touches, the flame that must first kindle itself before spreading to others, the flame that doesn't preach or persuade, but simply burns with such intensity that it illuminates the darkness and ignites other flames. If you recognize yourself as one of those who has seen beyond the veils, who has perceived the dangerous truths that society isn't prepared to hear, Nietzsche would offer this advice. Don't rush to proclaim what you see. Don't seek external validation for your deepest insights. Instead, cultivate them silently. Let them mature in you until they become not just ideas, but ways of life. And then when the time is right, share them not as weapons but as gifts, not to demolish others' worlds but to invite those who are ready to create new worlds along with you. Comment below if you have experienced the consequences of sharing truths for which others weren't prepared. Subscribe to this channel where I explore the deepest and often misunderstood aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy and other thinkers who challenged the conventions of their times. Watch the video on your screen now about How Nietzsche Survived the Abyss, an exploration of how he applied his own philosophy to overcome despair and illness. Remember, strategic silence is not cowardice, it's cultivation, and the world needs philosophical gardeners much more than it needs philosophical bombs. Until the next dimension.